Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Alicia Seckham. While the largest and most advanced economy in Africa, South Africa has been amongst the most obvious choices when it comes to investing on the continent. 18 years since the country's democracy, and South Africa's made great strides through its political and economic reforms. But the country may be losing its title as the gateway to the rest of the continent.
Covering a total surface area of just over 1.2 million square kilometers and located on the most southern tip of Africa, South Africa is home to some 48 million people. After the turbulent history South Africa experienced, which was characterized by violence and racial segregation, the first multiracial elections were held in 1994, bringing the 46-year apartheid policy to an end and ushering in a majority rule by the African National Congress, also known as the ANC, under the leadership of former President Nelson Mandela. In a bid to address past inequalities, the country implemented Black Economic Empowerment, a strategy which was designed to increase the participation in the economy of historically disadvantaged South Africans. These types of policies, among other regulatory reforms, have impacted on business practices and foreign investment. In spite of comprehensive approaches to eradicating poverty and hunger through social policies, poverty and inequality is still very prevalent, making South Africa one of the most unequal societies in the world. Although still a middle-income country, South Africa is an emerging market heavily endowed with natural resources such as gold, diamonds and platinum, to which it exports to its trading partners China, USA and Japan. Machinery, chemicals and petroleum is mainly sourced from China, Germany and the USA. The EU still remains the country's main trading partner, and because of these trade ties and the current financial crisis in Europe, the country's GDP has remained subdued. Last week, the country's growth forecast was downscaled by the IMF to 3% from 3.3% for 2013. Growth expectations for this year, however, also lackluster and is predicted to post at 2.6%. But despite this picture, the primary focus for the South African government is boosting growth and investment in order to generate employment for South Africans.
Now joining me in studio to take a closer look at South Africa as a business and investment destination is Dawie Rood. He's Chief Economist at the Efficient Group, Greg Knott, Director and Head of Africa Practice at Worksman's Attorneys, and joining us from Lagos, Nigeria, Yinka Sani, Deputy CEO at Stanbic IBTC. Thank you all for joining us today. Let's get straight into conversation. Greg, with the recent spate of wildcat strikes we've seen, South Africa's been in the spotlight as an investment destination. We've seen equity market outflows. We've seen the rand weaken to a 3.5-year low against the dollar on the back of domestic issues primarily. Your view on where South Africa stands as an investment destination right now?
Alicia, thank you very much. It is really a critical juncture for our democracy. We've fought hard for it, 18 years of democracy. We've built and created institutions which I think we as South Africans should be absolutely proud of. If one looks at our constitution, it's something we should embrace just as we do the South African flag. These are issues which are very pertinent to us. Our economy really faces, as I said, a juncture. It's my belief, though, as South Africans, we've got leaders, we've got institutions which can pull us through this particular rough period of time. And I'm hopeful and optimistic, and I don't want to sound naive, but I'm hopeful and optimistic that this will be a period of time that we look back on and say, don't waste this crisis. It is a crisis, but it's time for us to work together to be able to pull together both as business, labour and also government. It's time to have the conversation. We can't be complacent. And as I said, and I'm talking now as a lawyer, that we certainly have got the institutions. We certainly got the legal framework for investment. And so I'm taking a view that as South Africa we can pull out and pull back onto the difficulty with Alicia, of course, is that we step back a bit. And it's always hard to make ground, so we can't lose that ground.
Well, Dawie, it's interesting that Greg made the kind of points he did, because all through, the recent month, we've been talking about a leadership vacuum in South Africa. We've been talking about the fact that you've got an organization like NEDLAC, that's very apparent, but we're not seeing the workings of it very apparent right now in terms of finding resolution to the current problem we find. And what was interesting is that despite all of this creating a lot of of nervousness in the investment community. You've got a spokesperson for COSATU saying just this week on Carte Blanche that for every investor that steps out of the South African economy, you've got an investor that will step in. To what extent do you agree with commentary like that?
No, that is very naive. We have to remember that we are competing with many other countries out there for that pool of international capital that is sloshing around. And we want that pool of capital to come to South Africa and to be invested in South Africa. But coming back to your first question, is South Africa going to stay and remain the gateway to Africa? And the answer to that is most definitely yes. The South African economy is by far the biggest economy in Africa. But more importantly, South Africa's financial markets are so well regulated, are so liquid, and are so integrated with the rest of the world, and are so sophisticated that we can be compared to just about any other country in the world. And it's going to be extremely difficult for any other country to overtake South Africa in Africa. I think what we're currently experiencing, the things that you've mentioned, there certainly is a political vacuum. There's a lot of uncertainty as far as policy is concerned. We don't really know what economic policy in South Africa. I'm supposed to know, I'm an economist, but I get all these conflicting messages from government. There are a couple of things that we need to change, but there's so much going for South Africa that I have no doubt that we always do this. We somehow paint ourselves into a corner, and somehow we always get out of that. We're going to get out of this one as well.
Let's get a Nigerian's perspective on this. Yinka, let's take the conversation to you. I mean, I was at a conference last week, and the point that was made by one of the speakers at the event was, at least when you're investing in a country like Angola, you know exactly where the landmines are. You know that there are landmines about. In South Africa, you just don't know where they are. So, you know, from a Nigerian perspective, what's your view on the investment landscape and the investment case that South Africa is currently putting on the table?
There's a compelling case for investing in South Africa for many reasons that I can give you some of them now. I believe that South Africa presents an opportunity from an access point of view. Incredible access that investors get to South Africa, easy to do business. The returns are competitive relative to comparable countries around the world. Huge GDP, close to $400 billion, and still growing. This year, the economy is projected to grow at 2.3% or thereabout. The stock market has been on a roll. In terms of physical infrastructure, South Africa presents decent infrastructure compared to the rest of Africa. So in my mind, the case for South Africa still leading the pack into the near future for some time is pretty strong.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty strong, but you know, amidst it all, we've got this perception of a nuanced shift in economic policy, and certainly louder calls from within the ruling alliance for change, begging the question, where are we headed in terms of long-term sustainable economic policy, and are we getting concrete enough answers being put on the table?
Alicia, I think one thing that investors love, and that's certainty. So we've got to provide the certainty for investors. And to a large degree, in terms of, I said before, our regulatory environment, and our legal makeup, we've provided that certainty. But there are big red flags out there. One of them, of course, is nationalisation.
Absolutely.
And that is put on the table, and that spooks investors. So some clarity has got to come in and around nationalisation. And despite the best efforts of the Minister, Shobangu, foreign investors still get different calls coming from our country, and that's what they're wary of. So we've got to be consistent in our message, we've got to be certain in our message, and we do that in a number of ways. Our political leaders must say the same thing as our business people, as our labour leaders. And that's what we've got, a concerted effort to talk as South Africans and show that certainty.
Okay, so let's take a look at some policy that's been put on the table. I mean, we've got BEE being tabled, and obviously this very much a drive of the South African government, Davi. In some quarters, the constraints of BEE are working towards leading to more aversion. I mean, it's a fine line that needs to be walked here between addressing the inequalities of the past and actually keeping investment appeal strong. So to what extent can or should governments adopt more progressive policies while at the same time addressing those past imbalances?
Can I just make a technical comment? Because quite often what is said is that South Africa attracts X% FDI of GDP, for example, compared to Mozambique, where their FDI inflows are significantly larger relative terms than coming into South Africa. And it's just a bit of a technical point. Remember, South Africa's financial markets are so liquid and so attractive, it is possible and it's easy to invest in a JSE. And it's much easier to invest in our JSE than in a stock market in Mozambique, for example, because they don't have one. So if you want to invest in South Africa, quite often you will go to the JSE or on the bond market, whatever the case might be, easier than going to start a new factory, for example. For that simple reason, in relative terms, our portfolio flows are quite often much larger than FDI. And you will get exactly the opposite in many other countries in Africa. And it is because our financial markets are more sophisticated. But I think the important point that you are making is that, and that's the reality, we have a certain political issues on the realities in South Africa, and we've got certain social realities. And government most definitely take a step to the left when in 1994, but in the recent, say, 3 or 4 years, there has been a further step to the left. And you can see it in all sort of variables. You can see it in government expenditure going up. You can see the emphasis is more and more on current expenditure. It's more on social kind of expenditures. And there is an increase in the tax burden. We're probably going to see a further increase in the tax burden to address the issues that you've mentioned. But I think what is important is to realize, for government, and the politicians don't always realize this, that there's a limit to these sort of things. Of course, you can use the private sector and the resources by way of taxes that the private sector provides you. But you can't overdo that, because then you're going to start killing the engine of wealth creation. And I think we're pretty close to that. But what needs to happen, and that's the reason why I think Minister Chabangu last week made a comment, nationalization is not on the table. So they shouldn't be clear about policy only. They have to repeat policy all the time.
You know, it's all good us sitting here and having this discussion, Yinka, at the desk, you know, where consensus seems to be that South Africa holds this competitive advantage. You've got to ask the question, for how long, though? I mean, comments not so long ago was that Nigeria will surpass South Africa as a leading economy on the African continent. It seemed a bit far-fetched when that point was made. Now, with all that's playing out, some people saying, well, that's not so hard to see.
I think you have to compare the basics. And when, you know, the argument is made about Nigeria surpassing South Africa soon, you need to look at the comparatives. In terms of GDP, South Africa, you know, multiples of Nigeria's, almost twice. In terms of population, granted, Nigeria is 3 times the size of South Africa. But I think that South Africa, given the system, the near world-class way of operating businesses, the reporting systems, the corporate governance, as well as the manufacturing technology, which has been in place for a long time. I think it would take some time before Nigeria catches up and maybe leaves South Africa. It's also good to note that in the last 4 or 5 years, where the world economy experienced a great downturn, South Africa, for reasons we all know, discipline, focus, and all that, has been able to weather the storm, so that whilst the rest of the world has experienced a deceleration, we saw South Africa last year recover, and this year we expect a positive growth as well in South Africa. So the point I'm making is that South Africa has been making steady progress. The disposable income in the middle class has been growing, and so it would take some time before the prediction that has often been made would come to pass, the prediction of Nigeria surpassing South Africa in terms of the size of the economy.
So where exactly are the businesses, you get exposure to via the Stanbic IBTC, a corporate investment banking arm, where are they directing their attention right now when it comes to investing in South Africa, Yinka?
the various sectors in South Africa that are proved very attractive to investors in Nigeria would include the real estate sector. And in terms of manufacturing, it's public knowledge that a major Nigerian conglomerate is seeking investment in the cement business in South Africa. There's also the consumer goods sector, not as attractive as Nigeria, or they don't deliver as much returns as Nigeria, but you can see that there's steady growth into the future in South Africa. In a nutshell, Nigerians have been, we have seen inquiries about people wanting to invest in real estate, in manufacturing, in South Africa. So the opportunities abound in various sectors in South Africa.
Well, Yinka, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us this afternoon. Yinka Sani is Stanbic IBTC Deputy CEO. We're heading into a quick commercial break right now, but more on Invest Africa when we return, so don't go away.